Okay, now let's look at cost curves for a firm in the long run. What do economies of scale mean? A narrow definition of economies of scale is that as a firm increases its scale, and what we mean by scale is that it increases the quantity of all of the inputs used in the production process. So it doesn't just add more workers to an existing factory, it builds more factories, for example. That's increasing its scale. Now it's possible when it increases its scale and produces more output, there could be cost savings on average due to that fact. It might be that as a firm increases its scale, produces more output, that the productivity of some of its inputs increases. So workers might become more productive. They can produce more than they could before. These are sometimes known collectively as increasing returns to scale. And that would be the basis for economies of scale. A broader definition would also include the fact that as a firm becomes larger, it might be able to obtain lower prices for its inputs. Maybe it can offer its workers lower wages, or maybe it can get better deals on its raw materials than before. All of this means that when a firm increases its scale, the average cost of production in the short run will decrease. And this means that the short run average cost curve will shift to the right and down at the same time. Here's a representation of what I mean. So the average total cost curve, as the firm gets larger, it increases its scale, shifts right and down, right and down, right and down. The firm is going to choose the lowest points for whatever output it's deciding on these short-run average total cost curves. Those lowest points are represented by the red lines there. Those red lines make up what we would call the long-run average cost, because in the long run it will choose to produce at some point on this red lumpy line. We can see that that red lumpy line has a downward trajectory as the firm increases its scale. That is, its average total costs are falling, for the reasons I briefly outlined before. Now, if we wanted to make that lumpy line a smoother line, we would need to add intermediate stages between average total cost 1 and average total cost with 2 factories or 3 factories. So we're taking the lowest point on the short run, all of these short run average total cost curves. That gives us a nice smooth long run average total cost curve. Now that's largely theoretical, but the basic point is the same and it's clearer in this case. Diseconomies of scale is, graphically anyway, essentially the same thing except in the opposite direction. So here we're talking about, again, a firm increasing its scale, but in this case the firm might be getting too big for its boots, so to speak. That is, as the firm becomes larger and larger, some of the inputs used in the production process may become less productive than before. It might be that labour becomes disenchanted, workers become disenchanted or demotivated or alienated from their work and lives, and so they become less productive. It might be that management simply can't coordinate an ever larger or gigantic operation, and so diseconomies creep in. Management or management techniques become less productive as well. That's on the narrow definition, so we would say that the problem here is decreasing returns to scale. But a more expanded definition would also include the possibility that as a firm becomes larger, its input prices might actually rise. Now, how could that be? Well, it's possible, especially when it comes to labour, it's possible that as a firm becomes very, very large and it has an extremely large workforce, that workforce might start to unionise in order to improve their pay and conditions. And in that way they might bargain for higher wages, so the price of labour would go up. It's also conceivable that in very large companies and corporations that management might award itself exorbitant salary increases and bonuses and so on, which also increase the price of this managerial labour. So how does this affect the shape of the long-run average cost curve? Well, as we saw before, this is a case where as the firm becomes larger in scale and produces ever larger amounts of output, its short-run average total cost curve shifts to the right, but up as well. Right up, right up. And so if we then look at the lowest points on these short-run average cost curves, we can see that there's a trajectory upwards. Those lowest points, that red line, is a lumpy long-run average total cost curve. As the firm's scale increases, the cost per unit of production goes up for the reasons I've just outlined. Again, if we wanted to make this long-run curve not so lumpy, we would need intermediate stages between these here, 1 factory, 2 factories, 3 factories, as exemplified by this. Again, we can more clearly see that as the scale of the operations increase, the average cost of production goes up. Remember, this is all in the long run because you can vary all of the inputs into the production process. What does constant returns to scale mean? Well, this is basically where neither of the above two cases. That is, a firm increases its scale of operations, it builds more factories and adds more workers and uses more raw materials, but this does not cause the short-run average total cost curves to rise or to fall. They shift rightwards, but they don't rise or fall. So you can see what's going to happen here. If we take so we can see the short-run average cost curve, it's shifting right, indicating increasing scale. It's producing more. Shifts right, but it doesn't go, the curves don't have a trajectory up or trajectory down. So we get this lumpy long-run average total cost curve that is neither heading upwards nor downwards. If we wanted to make it really, really clear, again, we add intermediate stages in between the ones I've indicated here to give us this. So we have a long-run average total cost curve which is flat. The firm increases its scale, but its cost per unit of output doesn't change. Alright, so that's that. Oh, by the way, why would that be the case? Well, it might be just that as the firm increases its scale, the productivity of its inputs simply don't change, or the prices of its inputs simply don't change. Another possibility that's been suggested by some economists is that there might be some economies of scale in some respect, but there's diseconomies of scale in some other respect, so that they effectively cancel out and you end up getting no change. Alright. So here is the standard textbook long-run average total cost curve. We've seen the parts of them, but a standard story would be something along the following lines. as the firm increases its scale, it can take advantage of various economies of scale that come with that. But those economies of scale are eventually exhausted. There's limits to how much you can increase the productivity of your inputs, or how low the prices of those inputs could go. And so you end up going into a phase of constant costs to scale. But after that, it's possible that as a firm, if a firm increases its output even more, it might start to experience diseconomies of scale. That is, the inputs into the production process might become less productive due to the massive size of the organisation, or there might be increases in the prices of the inputs, especially the price of labour, and possibly the price of managerial labour as well. So that would be the standard story told. So you get this big grin of a long-run average total cost curve. Some economists argue that this is not accurate, however, that it's more likely in the real world to see an average total cost curve that goes like this. There's no diseconomies of scale. You just have economies of scale initially and then constant cost to scale. So a firm can expand indefinitely without its costs rising or falling. It's also possible, it's argued, that a firm might experience continuous economies of scale. So it doesn't ever get to, there's no constant costs of scale or diseconomies of scale. There's just economies of scale as far as the eye can see. They might be diminishing economies of scale, but nonetheless, they are there. As the firm keeps increasing its scale of operations, increasing its output, its average total costs continue to fall. Now, I'm not obviously going to attempt to resolve this debate, but let's try and be ecumenical about it and say it could be that you could have this, theoretically, you could have this smiley face long-run average total cost curve as a theoretical possibility. But in practice, it might not be relevant. For example, let's say this is the demand for this firm's product. We don't really need to know about the rest of the cost curve. It's not practically relevant anymore. In this case, if this were a real-world case, when we were to look at the data for the firm, we would see economies of scale. Only economies of scale over the range of the demand curve that's relevant. But it's also possible that demand might be higher than that. In this case, it's still true that some of this long-run average cost curve is simply not relevant. So we would have a scenario like this, and this is what some economists argue for. That is, where you have economies of scale and then just constant returns to scale. That's what becomes relevant. Diseconomies of scale are just a theoretical possibility, at best. But it's at least conceivable that demand might be so high, all other things remaining constant, that the scale of operations in satisfying that demand might become so vast that you would have diseconomies of scale starting to creep in. But many economists argue that this kind of scenario is actually pretty rare, and that this or this are more realistic in many markets, especially industrial markets, markets for various kinds of manufactured goods where there can be mass production occurring.